Hey everyone. So, first of all, yes, it's been a long time since my last YouTube video. I don't know, like over a year at least. But I do want to get back in the swing of making videos. I want to get back to, I don't know, doing a little bit of criticism, sharing my thoughts about things that I'm passionate about. And so, to that end, I thought it might be fun if I created a little video where I took all of this year's Best Picture nominees and ranked them. So what I've done is I've taken all of the films that have been nominated for the Academy Award for Best Picture in this year, 2026, and I've ranked them from worst to best. And we're going to move through them in that order. Just quickly up front, a few things. First of all, this is totally extemporaneous. I wanted to do a fun little video. I have some notes here, but I do not have a script. So you'll probably hear me kind of flail around. You'll probably hear me stumble and stutter and struggle a little bit. But I'm going to try to edit the worst of it out. And I'm going to try to just be honest and passionate about my feelings about these movies. Now, that said, these are exactly that. These are my feelings. These are my opinions. These are my thoughts on the film. And since they're opinions, they're subjective. All opinions are subjective. So if you totally disagree with me, if, say, the film I think is the worst of the year, you think was the best of the year, then feel free to disagree with me. That's great. Put your opinion in the comments. Try to be kind. Try to be polite. Try to be considerate. I'm just going to try to speak passionately to the best of my ability about these films. I'm not trying to rage bait here. I'm not trying to just be vicious or nasty for the sake of engagement. So I ask that you bring that same kind of spirit to the comments. Tell me what you loved about these films. Tell me how you disagree with me, but operate from a position of real interest in the art. Don't just come in trying to pick a fight, please. I'm also going to try to avoid spoilers to the best of my ability. I'm going to operate under the assumption that you may not have seen all of these films and that you may still want to see some of them, that you may be watching this video exactly because you want to figure out what movie to watch next. There are a couple of instances where I might have to get close to spoiler territory, but in those instances, I will at least warn you first. Oh, and one final warning, I'm absolutely going to mispronounce some names here. There are foreign films nominated. There are actors and actresses whose names I've never pronounced out loud before. And just generally, that's not something I'm super good at. I've had people in the comments of past videos saying, no, it's pronounced this way. And listen, that's fair game. But I just want you to know up front that I'm going to make some mistakes. And finally, before we get started, I just want to thank Medina Allen, who commented on one of my previous videos and asked me to do a Tarkovsky ranking. This isn't that, Alan, and I do promise I'm going to try to do that. Maybe that'll be my next video. But that idea did lead to this idea, so I want to thank him anyway for getting me back on the path to making videos again. All right, without further ado, I have 10 movies to rank, and number 10 is Frankenstein. Boy, was this a frustrating film to watch. And yes, it's down here at number 10, so you must know I just did not enjoy this movie at all. And it wasn't because I didn't want to. Conceptually, I was so ready for this movie. I so wanted this movie to be good. I went into this film thinking, finally, we're going to get a really thoughtful adaptation of Frankenstein. We're going to get this classic Gothic novel finally adapted in a way that really does it credit, in a way that maybe really honestly and frankly explores its themes. Frankenstein has been this archetypal kind of hammer horror movie monster for so long that I think a lot of people have lost touch with the fact that it has its roots in literature, that actually there is this important work of fiction that is so intimately tied to this creature that we most often think of as this kind of stitch-faced caricature, with this like boxy head and the stiff gait, and has become like a children's cartoon character, basically, quite literally, right? To the point that he's actually even become a serial mascot. In fact, Frankenstein has become so culturally ubiquitous that there's another Frankenstein film releasing in theaters right now while I'm recording this video. So I really wanted something that would just strip away all the years and years and decades of cliches and exaggerations and goofiness and just general like cultural detritus, this thick cultural patina of expectations that is just like crusted over and adhered to this one's like legitimately, I think, great work of literature. And Frankenstein has some really legitimately powerful themes that a thoughtful, meticulously constructed film that took these ideas seriously could really explore. And not only are the novel's themes just generally universally compelling, but many of them are really relevant to this very historical moment. The question of what does it mean to create life? What does it mean to create intelligent life? Is there some limit to the human capacity for creation? Should there be some limit to the human capacity for creation? Is there a sort of intrinsic horror to watching as human beings push their scientific and creative capacity past a certain point? Is there a certain terror to the idea of humanity approaching a realm that we once considered exclusive to God? Unfortunately, this film has absolutely zero interest in exploring any of those themes. And instead, it just wants to subsist on pure spectacle. And yes, this is a superficially beautiful film. There's a lot going on in each shot. There's a high level of detail from scene to scene. The backgrounds are just rich in vivid detail. But honestly, after a certain point, all that detail just became fatiguing. It's hard to have beauty without a focal point. It's hard to have beauty amid clutter. It's hard to have beauty when every scene is jammed with so much eye-popping detail that you just kind of throw up your hands and give up. Frankly, this film almost looks like a video game cutscene. Or a series of video game cutscenes. Those Unreal Engine 5 demos that are just designed to show you what a particular engine can do? It's like, look how much processing power we have. Look at the sheer number of objects we can render and cram into this scene. Or maybe the film looks kind of like the Gothic equivalent of a Thomas Kinkade painting, where you just look at it and it's like, well, there's a lot there. Obviously, this man has some kind of technical understanding of his craft, but the end result is just numbing. It's just like, oh, okay, there's more of that. What's the purpose here? What's the focus? Let me see something. Let me see one individual thing, and let me see it with some intensity and some sense of purpose and some sense that it ties into something greater. Let me see you be passionate about just one thing in this frame, instead of just throwing everything at me and hoping that I don't mind that it looks like, something where it looks like there should be text at the bottom saying, this was rendered on the PS5 Pro, But, if this film was just too much visually, if it was just kind of garish and gaudy, but its heart was in the right place, but it was still really centered on the story that it wanted to tell, then I would forgive it that. But that's really not the case here. In fact, if anything, this movie is just completely disinterested in the themes of the novel. This film is just completely and fundamentally disinterested in exploring any of the ideas that I mentioned earlier. In fact, it's so disinterested in this that it fumbles one of the core moments in the story. One of the absolutely fundamental scenes in this film should have been when Frankenstein realizes that he's made a mistake, when he sees the monster for the first time and is filled with this sense of existential horror at the idea that he's somehow become God, that he has overstepped his bounds and has created life. That is really the key moment early in the novel when Frankenstein is finally faced with what he's done, when he sees his creation come to life, and he realizes that he has made some fundamental mistake. That he's filled with this sense of revulsion at what he's done. And this film completely ruins that because really, this film throws all of that out. All of those ideas, all of that horror, all of that existential dread, and all of that regret, and replaces it with a love triangle. And not even a love triangle, it's actually like a love rectangle or a love square. And without spoiling too much, the film leaves us with the sensation that Frankenstein abandons the monster, discards his creation, not because he's like filled with this horror at what he's done, or because he feels like he's violated some deeply rooted law of nature, but because he thinks the monster is going to take the affections of the woman that he's obsessed with. First of all, this is annoying because the director, Del Toro, has gone back to this Beauty and the Beast well before. This is kind of like one of his hobby horses, one of the, I don't even really want to call it a theme because it's not developed enough to be a theme, but one of the like tropes that he's relentlessly obsessed with. And so you get the vibe that he couldn't help but shoehorn this trope, this Beauty and the Beast thing, into this film. And maybe he could have made the Beauty and the Beast thing work if it was supplemental, if instead of it feeling like he's replacing the central ideas of the novel with this kind of obvious pseudo relationship, it was just an expansion of those themes, right? Like if he was able to weave that gently together, but he just doesn't do that. Instead, you get a ton of melodrama, you get a ton of really like hilariously bad, overwritten dialogue where that characters are like screaming at each other, and a lot of like relentless, bloody, graphic violence, way in excess of what would have been in a more direct adaptation of the novel. But, I feel like I'm making the point that, oh, they should have just done a straight adaptation of the book. And that's not fair. And that's not even what I think. Like, if this movie had its own ideas, even if they were completely different than Mary Shelley's ideas, if it had its own ideas, and if it presented those ideas in a way that was compelling and made sense, then I'd be on board. I'd be sold. But instead, it's just relentless. It's just relentless visual detail. It's just relentless noise. It's relentless violence. And it's just garish and silly. It's so silly. It ends up being such an absurd film. It takes the film 45 excessive, endless minutes to even get to the moment when Frankenstein brings his creation to life. And those 45 minutes are almost entirely silly and unbearable and wasted. There's some fun scenery chewing from Christoph Waltz, but otherwise that first stretch of the film is almost unwatchable. And it's almost ironic because this film's most profound flaw is in some ways an extension of the one thing about it that actually almost kind of works. And that's the performances by Oscar Isaac and Jacob Elordi. They are so good and so good against all odds. Oscar Isaac is really good at capturing the mania and obsession of Dr. Frankenstein. And Elordi is just really, really pitch perfect as the monster, as the creature. And the few moments that this film allows the two of them to be on screen together, it almost starts to feel like something is happening. You almost start to get the sensation that, oh, there might be a movie here. There might be something compelling here. But here's the absurd and insane thing. For whatever reason, Del Toro barely allows them to be on screen together. You would think, this is simple, right? The central relationship of this film is the relationship between Frankenstein and the monster he created. Everything hinges upon that. And yet, they're barely together. I think there are 3 moments, or at least 3 sequences, not quite scenes, but sequences throughout this film where they're allowed to share time and space together. And they play off each other so effectively. But this maybe accounts seriously, maybe for 15 total minutes of a movie that's close to 2 hours and 40 minutes long. And frankly, I don't know how this mistake was made because it's one of those things that seems intrinsically and inherently obvious. Like, of course, you want Dr. Frankenstein and the monster to share a lot of time on screen together. But instead, it's like, no, actually, I want this unnecessary romantic subplot. I want 45 minutes of Dr. Frankenstein robbing graves and climbing the tower in order to secure the lightning rod on top of his machine. Ugh. Like, I want all this fluff and lavish excess, but I don't want to touch the heart of the story, or I want to just like barely skim over the heart of the story, even though I've cast two really great actors. It's just bewildering to me. It's just bewildering to me. I'm still on the first movie. My voice is hoarse. It's time to move on. All right, so that brings us to film number 9. And number 9 on this list is Hamnet. And so you're already starting to see a theme kind of form near the bottom of this list. And that's films that take classic literature and somehow just fails to capitalize on the promise of their subject matter. And you know, I have to say up front, it's basically impossible for me to talk about this film without some spoilers, and fundamentally without spoiling something that happens about midway through this film. And I've seen a lot of synopsises of the movie spoil this plot point anyway, but if you want to watch the film kind of completely clean, completely uncontaminated, then I recommend that you look down at the bottom. I've put chapters in, skip to the next movie. And you know, I'll give you a second to do that if you want to. All right, so this is a film about the relationship between William Shakespeare and his wife Agnes. And more specifically, it's a film about how they handle the grief they feel after the death of their son, Hamnet. Yes, that's the titular Hamnet. And it's also about how this grief goes on to influence Shakespeare when he writes his play, Hamlet. So that's the Hamnet-Hamlet relationship that's inherent in the title. And honestly, this is just a relentlessly bleak, grim, demoralizing film to watch. And I know what you're saying. I know this is a film about grief. Of course it's going to be sad. Of course it's going to be demoralizing. That's what grief is. Grief is painful. But here's the thing. A film about grief should really be an exploration of grief, and an exploration of grief that gets at some of the nuance and complexity of how we as human beings experience loss. You know, grief is not just a lot of moaning and screaming and crying and characters like visibly distraught and people who once loved each other screaming at each other and freezing each other out and being cold to each other. Yes, there is some of that in grief. There's plenty of that in grief. There are plenty of moments of really intense, passionate, awful feeling that does come out in crying and moaning and screaming, and that does lead you to turn on people close to you and lash out at people close to you. But there's so much more to it than that. And this film just does not seem at all interested in digging under the surface of human grief, in finding any of the contradictions or complexities of human behavior. Like, there's one scene in the film A Ghost Story, and this is a very minor spoiler for that film, where a woman binge eats a pie. And that binge eating scene has more emotional honesty about how grief feels and how grief manifests itself than this entire freaking film. And I think this film feels so false because its characters feel false. Whether it's Shakespeare or his wife or the kids, everyone in this movie feels almost like historical reenactors, in the sense that they're doing their best to read a bunch of really stilted, faux historical dialogue, and none of which really feels like human speech. And also because the characters feel almost kind of young adult fiction-y in the way that they don't have real motivations and they don't behave like real human beings. Instead, things kind of happen to them and they respond to the things that happen to them by sort of crudely pantomiming human behavior. And I think this is reflective of a problem that I have with most of Chloe Zhao's films, which is that you have this really often beautiful naturalistic directing. The cinematography, the way the camera moves, the way scenes are framed, everything is trying to evoke this sense of incredibly naturalistic realism. But every word of the scripts in her films feels false, feels written, right? Like you can feel someone writing these words as you hear them performed. And so there's this weird dissonance where at once you're supposed to think, oh, this is almost a documentary. This is almost what it must have been like. And on the other hand, you're like, well, but every moment of this feels scripted. Every moment of this feels like it's taken directly from a script, from a screenplay, from a book, from some source other than the human world. And that clash really has dampened my appreciation of pretty much all of her films. And I think it's somehow worse in this film because at least her other movies are legitimately beautiful to look at. Nomadland, for example, is a truly gorgeous film. It has the same screenplay problems that this one does, but if you muted Nomadland and just watched it, oh my God, it's beautifully, beautifully shot. But this film really isn't. This is actually kind of a drab, ugly film to watch. And some of that, I think, is actually a result of this sort of pursuit of documentary style realism, because you have so many shots in this film that are shot exclusively by candlelight and they're so dark. And that wouldn't be a problem. And it really isn't a problem in theory, but in practice, you end up with these shots that are in these tiny enclosed wooden rooms that are sparsely decorated, which in and of itself wouldn't be that problematic, but they're also lit by candlelight. You can barely see what's going on. And what is going on is often like someone screaming or crying, or a child with blisters on its neck, or, and these are like real truths. Sickness and death are ugly, ugly things. But it kind of sucks that what was once one of the real standout highlights of watching one of Chloe Zhao's films becomes almost detrimental here, becomes almost another thing that's kind of dragging you towards this malaise, towards this indifference that you feel once you've been sort of brutalized by so much negative emotion. And it also adds to another problem with the film and with its kind of sense of history. It somehow has a view of Elizabethan England that's both way too colorless and drab and miserable, and also too romantic. I honestly don't know how the film manages to thread this needle the way that it does. Because at once, like I've said to death, there's so much darkness in this film, and there's so much disease, and there's so much misery, and there's so little light and hope and human optimism. But on the other hand, when the film does get romantic, and I don't just mean romantic in the sense of human relationships, of it getting lovey-dovey or something, but when it strains towards a more romantic, more stylized, more idealistic view of this world and human behavior, it somehow becomes more silly and more unbelievable and even less rooted in reality. But I do want to say some nice things about this movie too, because don't get me wrong, I did not hate this movie the way I hated Frankenstein. Yes, I did mostly find this film kind of a slog to get through. But once the film starts to introduce the actual works of Shakespeare, once we start to see Hamlet be performed later in the film, then something really happens. And part of this is, I think, that Shakespeare's play, Hamlet is just such a fundamentally captivating piece of writing that it's kind of hard to screw it up. It's kind of hard to hear someone reciting Hamlet and be like, oh, I don't care. But I want to give the movie more credit than that because the way that it takes Hamlet, takes the actual text of Hamlet, takes actual excerpts from Hamlet, and recontextualizes those excerpts to be about Shakespeare's grief, to be about the pain of loss. Excerpts that on their surface, you wouldn't really think of them that way. The way that it does that is actually, I think, kind of ingenious and kind of impressive. Yeah, there are a few moments that are kind of ham-fisted and kind of silly and kind of too much. There's a use of the famous to be or not to be soliloquy that is just like the most obvious. I even by saying that it's been included in this film, if you know that soliloquy, you're probably imagining right now the context in which it's used. So I have to be careful not to say any more to not spoil it. But once we see the play performed, and once we get a sense of how this movie is using the play, it works. It works on some level. And to be clear, just because I've seen some discourse about this online, I don't think it's an artistic sin for the film to be doing this. I don't think there's anything wrong about the film taking Hamlet and trying to force us to view it through the lens of Shakespeare's grief at the loss of his son. I know some people are like, well, that's not what the play is about. But listen, there have been so many adaptations of Shakespeare, many of which in some way distort the quote unquote original intent of the play. I mean, if you were online in 2016, you might remember that, was it the Royal Shakespeare Company? I think it might have been. It was some Shakespeare company did a production of Julius Caesar where they replaced Caesar with Donald Trump. And yeah, that's a little crass and obvious and silly in retrospect. But you also have like the somewhat famous Richard III film adaptation with Ian McKellen, where it's set in this sort of pseudo-fascist Britain in the 30s or 40s. So it's and so many more examples. Like there are as many different takes on Shakespeare as there are performances of Shakespeare. So there's absolutely nothing at all wrong with what Chloe Zhao and her screenwriter have done here. And there's nothing wrong. I haven't read the original novel, Hamnet, that's being adapted, but there's nothing wrong with doing that in the form of a novel, right? Where this film fails, though, is when there's no Shakespeare on screen except like the actor portraying Shakespeare. When there's none of Shakespeare's actual works on screen, it's just so dreary and so painful to watch. And hearing the musicality and liveliness of Shakespeare's language later in this play makes you realize how dead most of the language and how stiff most of the language is earlier in the film. So that's it. That's Hamnet. Didn't love it, but, few bright spots here and there, especially where Shakespeare's actual words appear on the screen. Okay. Film number 8 is next, and film number 8 is F1 the movie. So the premise of this film is that Brad Pitt plays an aging race car driver who is near the end of his career and drafted to join a struggling F1 racing team. And if that sounds like, man, I have seen that movie before. Yeah, this is basically the plot of every underdog sports movie ever. And the central problem of the film is exactly that. It really doesn't do much to elevate any of these cliches that we've seen so many times. Every piece of dialogue in this film, every human relationship in this film, every conflict in this film that happens off the racetrack feels like it's been cobbled together, feels like it's been stolen from other films. It's all so easy and repetitive and obvious. Like, of course, there's the love interest, and there's the ambitious younger driver who Brad Pitt's character has a rivalry with, and there's his older friend who runs the team and who has money invested in it and is always there to give Brad Pitt sage words of wisdom, and oh my God, and on and on and on. Every moment in this film, as I said, just feels so derivative. And if that's all there was to this film, if that was my entire opinion, it would be lower on this list. It would be at least below Hamnet, right? Maybe it wouldn't quite. I really disliked Frankenstein, but like it would at least be below Hamnet if this was just every underdog sports racing movie you've ever seen before regurgitated. But but this film has one thing going for it, and that's the fact that the racing scenes themselves are so compelling, are so captivating, are so well shot, are so exciting, have such like really brilliant cinematography. The editing in this film is incredible. The editing in this film takes a sport that I could care less about. I've never watched an F1 race in my entire life. Like maybe I've seen it on a TV at a restaurant or a relative's house and not even realized it, but I have never given my singular focused attention to an F1 race ever. And yet, every racing sequence in this film, I was just totally sucked in. I was totally sold. And so much of that ultimately comes down to the really carefully calibrated and carefully balanced editing in this film. Because there's a risk here, right? You have multiple shots from multiple angles. You have, the cars on the track. You have shots from within the cockpit. Is that the right term? With like dashboard cam style shots. You have rear view mirror shots. You have all these different shots. And if you get that balance wrong, right? Like if you hold one shot, one long shot too long, it starts to feel like, oh, I'm just watching this on TV, right? Like you hold a long overhead shot of the racetrack, and it's like, oh yeah, I'm kind of just watching an F1 race. You hold a long shot of the dashboard cam, and it's like, oh, I guess I'm playing Gran Turismo or something. And on the other hand, if you get too frenetic with your editing, it becomes a freaking headache. It becomes like a painful ADHD, like jilting, juddering, awful experience to watch. And you'd also lose track of the strategy that's going into these races and the tactics that are being deployed. But instead, the editing is brisk enough to keep everything exciting, to keep everything moving along at a pace that makes you feel like you're on the track, like you're really not just engrossed in this race as a spectator, but almost as a participant. And yet it's not so rapid and scattershot that it starts to feel like a TikTok compilation or something. And so I felt myself kind of dragged along with this film. I felt myself kind of drawn in, even as every single scene off the track, I was rolling my eyes and predicting exactly what was going to happen next. And even as I could like make a list of all of the films that this film burgled, I don't know. I was like, oh yeah, I'm kind of having fun here. Like every time he gets behind the wheel of a car, I'm kind of in. I'm kind of enjoying myself. And so I couldn't penalize the film too much. But I also couldn't rank it any higher than this because ultimately it's a pretty glossy, empty little movie that feels, I don't know, almost like a commercial for F1, almost like a commercial for Formula One racing, frankly. And that gets to my one last little grievance with the film, and I'm going to stick a spoiler alert here. I'm not going to spoil what specifically happens to any of the characters in the movie, but I'm going to spoil a moment in the movie, sort of, kind of. So if you don't want anything to be spoiled, just skip to the next film. I'm pretty much done here anyway. But, boy, the stakes in this film feel so low. You get the sense that this film is so eager to be, as I said, almost a commercial for Formula One, that it wants the sport to feel just dangerous enough, right? It wants the races to feel just dangerous enough without seeming truly life-threatening. And in fact, there's one moment in this movie, there's one crash scene that is, oh man, it's so frustrating. Because at this moment, I was like, oh, the film is really about to raise the stakes. Maybe I misjudged this movie a little bit. Maybe it is going to get into like some of the inherent actual danger of this sport in a way that that escalates the human drama. And then the movie just completely copped out. And it copped out in just the most absurd, silly, goofy way. To the degree that, like, when you see this moment in the film, when you see this crash and how it's presented, and then you see the aftermath of that crash and the stakes, it's hard to take anything that happens afterwards particularly seriously. And it's hard to be invested in these characters and what might happen to them. It's hard to even be invested in the basic plot of the movie because you know that it's never going to get that serious with its subject matter. All right, time for movie number 7. And the 7th film on this ranking is Bugonia. So, Bugonia. This film surprised me, and it surprised me because it didn't surprise me. And I know that sounds like some silly, goofy, like senseless wordplay or just nonsense or whatever, but let me explain. So I've seen a number of, and I'm going to butcher his name, Yorgos Lanthimos' films, and I haven't loved them all. Some of them I have legitimately really liked. I thought The Favorite was a wonderful and brilliant film. And some of them I really don't think quite work. Like, I don't think The Lobster 100% works. I think it's an interesting film, but anyway, we're not talking about The Lobster. But so even though I haven't loved all of his films, one thing I can say is his films have consistently surprised me. They're entirely unique and original works of cinema. They are like no other movies I've ever seen, and no two of them are like each other. It's kind of amazing, this man's capacity for just sheer originality and sheer inventiveness. And so I was really surprised by Bugonia because it's such a fundamentally predictable film. So the premise here, in case you don't know, is that a conspiracy theorist and his cousin kidnap a CEO who they believe is an alien. And listening to that premise, you might say, oh, that sounds like it's going to be a really unique film, or oh, that sounds like nothing I've ever heard of before. Well, maybe, but honestly, if you think about it, you probably actually have seen movies like this before. You have probably seen a thriller about a kidnapping where you're supposed to wonder about the true motives of the kidnappers, where you're supposed to wonder about the identity of the person who's been kidnapped, and where there's going to be this sort of tension and game of cat and mouse between them, and where you're always going to be wondering who has the upper hand in any given scene, who's going to double cross who, and so on and so forth. And you've also probably seen a film where there's some fundamental question about the secret identity or lack thereof of a character, where you're supposed to look at one character in the film and say, oh, are they this or are they that? And you know that the film's going to indulge in some back and forth. It is going to play with your perception and make you think at one moment, oh no, this character is definitely this. And then at another moment, oh wait, no, maybe they're actually that. And all the films that fall into those categories tend to use certain tropes and tend to be plotted in a certain way. And their plots tend to advance according to a certain formula. And the thing that shocked me is how little this movie does to subvert that formula, how rigidly it sticks to that formula. All right, I'm not going to spoil too much here, but there's a scene very early in the film where one of the kidnappers runs into a person he knows who happens to be a cop, and there's a personal relationship there. And we just know immediately this cop character is going to reappear later in the film. And we can guess the exact moment when he's going to reappear because we've seen so many films with exactly this kind of character, and we know exactly when it's going to be necessary for the plot for him to pop up again. And we also know exactly how that's going to play out. And it does play out exactly like we expect. And yeah, the film does have some really strong performances from Jesse Plemons and Emma Stone that do elevate it some. And you do get some of Lanthimos's kind of sick and perverse sense of humor in the film that helps some of these very formulaic scenes have a little bit of a sharper edge and add some levity to them. Like that relationship I just mentioned between the kidnapper and the cop has a has a wrinkle to it that you would not find in any other film. And the film does kind of gesture at some larger political and social ideas, some contemporary issues, and you have some discourse between the characters about that. And that can be kind of captivating in the moment, but it's all so paper thin. It's all just like a veneer of importance that's laid on top of this otherwise very predictable sort of black comedy thriller. And even though the performances are strong, the underlying characters are pretty shallow and almost have to be by necessity. Because on the one hand, for Jesse Plemons' character, you're always supposed to be asking, oh, like, is he crazy or does he have real insight? Does he really understand what's going on? And likewise, with Emma Stone's character, you're always supposed to be asking, is she an alien or is she not an alien? And the fact that the film has to keep that tension in place all times prevents it from getting too far under either character's surface. We do get some insight into what's going on with Jesse Plemons' character, but it's kind of it's kind of basic. It's kind of like, it's your standard sort of there's been a family tragedy motive. And so since exploring these characters in too much depth will give too much away, will spoil the game that the film is playing with us, we end up with fairly shallow, kind of vacant characters that it's hard to be invested in. And one thing I will give the film is that it has a truly beautiful and haunting final sequence. Without saying anything about what that sequence is, it's riveting. It's just, oh man, it really gets under your skin and it really works. But the unfortunate thing is it comes at the end of a movie that I felt so like disinvested in, that I felt like so little connection to, that I cared so little about, even as I enjoyed parts of it, and even as I found parts of it kind of funny or kind of compelling. Like, I had so little fundamental emotional investment in this film that final sequence just could not have the power that it would have had if everything that had come before had been stronger. So yeah, that's Bugonia. And I want to pause right now, not quite midway through the list, to say something. And that's, I want to draw a line. I want to draw a line in the sand right here between the movies that I've already covered and the movies that are coming next. Because every movie after this point, I think, is a legitimately good to great film. And in fact, I would say every movie after this point you should watch. I recommend unequivocally and wholeheartedly. And in fact, after this point, the ranking gets a lot harder. And the next three films in particular really could have been in almost any order. Like 6, 5, and 4, really close race, really hard. I had to really think about how to place these films, and I'm still not sure. So yeah, I know it seems like I've been pretty critical up to this point, but rest assured, there are some really good films ahead. So, with that said, number 6 is Sinners. And I feel like putting this movie at number 6 might be a little controversial, just because I've heard so much discourse about this film, and all of it seems to fall pretty cleanly into one of two camps. Either this is just about one of the greatest films of the 21st century, easily the best film of the year, and it deserves to win all the Oscars for all of its performances and for its director and everything else, or it's totally overrated, didn't even deserve to be nominated, and its nomination was some kind of political statement. And you know what I'm saying. And I don't really think either of those assessments are fair. Personally, I think it legitimately is a pretty great film. I think it totally deserved to be nominated. I think the performances are outstanding, and maybe I'll talk about that a little more later. But I do think the film is profoundly flawed. Or maybe more specifically, I think the film has one really big, serious flaw. But first, I want to talk about what this film does right, because it does so much right. Because it's such a fun, captivating, just exhilarating film through most of its runtime. First of all, I think this is just a brilliant, ingenious film on the conceptual level. It really doesn't matter whether you're sitting down to watch this as a kind of genre popcorn vampire horror flick, or whether you're sitting down to watch it as a like serious meditation on race and racism and culture in American history. It really works as both of those films without sacrificing the other. Because on a pure pulpy genre level, this film is not afraid to really dig into the mechanics of its vampires. You have a lot of vampire movies that maybe like play lip service to the rules that vampires have to follow, but the way this film establishes those guidelines, right? The way the film establishes the fact that the vampires need to be invited in first and foremost, and the way that it then exploits and builds and innovates and spins on that premise without betraying it is really, really captivating and really fun. And even more than that, the way the film sketches out its concept of vampirism and the rules by which its vampires have to abide dovetails so perfectly with the deeper themes and ideas of the film. This is very much a film that views race and music and art and culture through the lens of negotiation. And the fact that it does that, I think, makes it a much smarter and more nuanced portrayal of those themes than it otherwise might have been. You can easily imagine a simpler, stupider, crasser version of the film where the vampires are simply a bunch of racist white people and the whole movie boils down to a battle between the largely black and minority occupants of the speakeasy and the racist white vampires outside. And I think if that movie was this movie, some of the more politicized critiques of the film would probably land better for me. But that's not what Sinners is. Instead, Sinners is a film that has some really like profound and interesting questions about what it means to integrate and what it means to hold on to some part of your cultural essence, either as a slave or as an immigrant, as someone who came from outside of America and entered America. How much of your own perception of yourself in like cultural and ethnic and historical terms are you willing to sacrifice in order to cease being an oppressed minority and become a more mainstream part of the American population? It's really sort of a critique of the melting pot concept. And it's a critique that doesn't come down cleanly on one side or another. And I think the decision to make the head vampire an Irish immigrant who has all these memories of hundreds of years of oppression, stretching all the way back to his time in Ireland, to his time suffering under colonialism and the British, and who is now in America, and who almost seems to see himself, to put it in more contemporary terms, as part of this sort of global struggle of oppressed people. Like this global vampire unity movement that's that's going to overcome, white supremacy and colonialism. I think like on the one hand, like, oh man, that is just so unlike what you'd expect going in, especially if you've seen Black Panther, or if you have expectations about Coogler as a director and a filmmaker, and if you want to see this as a film that's purely about like racism in scare quotes. Instead, what you get almost feels like this sort of struggle between ideas of Black identity and progressive movement ideals that say, well, we need to all come together. It's like intersectional ideas that like stack different concepts of oppression on top of each other in order to try to create some kind of shared movement and shared goals. And I know that's abstracting out the film maybe a little too much. And I don't want to get my own personal politics involved here because that's not what I'm doing. Like, I'm more interested in how this film plays with its own ideas and how it's refusing to simplify those ideas and make them easy and palatable, and how it refuses, and I think this is what I really love about the film, how it refuses to just make the vampires a purely antagonistic force. Instead, like, you have some real sympathy with them. And there were certainly moments in the film where I was like, yeah, they kind of have a point. And I love how all of this is kind of wrapped up in the metaphor of losing your soul. Because that's what you sacrifice in theory when you become a vampire. In theory, some fundamental part of yourself is lost in order to gain this immortality and power and protection. And I think when you take that and kind of juxtapose it on the deeper themes of this film, like how much of your cultural identity, how much of your ethnic or racial identity are you willing to give up in order to get all the perks of being part of Western society, of being fully accepted and fully integrated into this larger culture? Like, those two things fit together so perfectly. It's one of these cases where there's this perfect dovetailing of theme and actual plot. Also, as I said before, all of the performances are obviously phenomenal. Michael B. Jordan is so good in his kind of dual role here as Smoke and Stack. And even more so, Delroy Lindo is so freaking good. And I feel like I keep saying freaking, even though that is just not part of my normal vocabulary. You can probably guess which word I'm choosing not to use for YouTube purposes, but it feels really awkward whenever I say it. Anyway, but Delroy Lindo is just absolutely phenomenal and gives a performance that just, oh my gosh, it's so powerful because he's taking a role that another actor might have reduced to caricature or even an archetype. This sort of drunken bluesman persona actually comes precariously close to a stereotype, but his performance is so full of pathos and so full of just honest and sincere pain that you believe every second of it, and it never feels like it's reduced to something simpler or crasser than what's on the screen. And what's on the screen is just an absolutely riveting portrayal of a man who has been really brutalized but never fully broken. And oh my gosh, it's just so moving and powerful and effective. And I feel like I've been talking about this movie for way longer than I planned to already, but I do want to quickly point out how good the music is and how thematically appropriate the music is. Not just the blues music that's throughout a lot of the film, although that's phenomenal, but the way the film contrasts that music with Celtic folk music later, with Irish folk songs. First of all, that contrast is so thematically perfect, but even setting the contrast aside, the way these folk songs are turned into these kind of haunting vampire anthems, it's so chilling and it's so perfect. But I did say that this movie has a real flaw. I won't call it a fatal flaw because, as you can probably guess, I really enjoyed most of the movie. But it's a significant flaw, and it's one that prevented me from putting it higher on this list. And unfortunately, the flaw is also kind of a spoiler. So that's tricky. I will say that I'm not about to spoil the fate of any of the characters in this film. So this isn't this character died and it ruined the film kind of spoiler. But it is about the final third of the film. So if you haven't seen Sinners yet and you just want to go in completely unspoiled, you can trust that at least it's a film that you should definitely watch. But it would be wrong for me to just say, oh yeah, this film is secretly flawed in some way and not tell you where I think it goes wrong. So I am going to do that now, fair warning. And the big mistake I think this film makes is that it chooses to resolve all of these fascinating conflicts with one really rather generic, protracted action sequence. All of this just leads to a big fight scene. So this film has taken all this time to really, in fascinating detail, sketch out the fact that these vampires need to be invited into this bar, that they want to get in, that the people inside don't want them in. And so you would think that would mean that either there would have to be a tense negotiation between these two parties, or that the vampires would have to play some kind of ingenious trick to get inside, or that otherwise the film would take this underlying rule, this underlying premise that has been working with for all this time and pay it off in the finale. Or even better, that it would take all these fascinating social and political themes that it's been toying with and integrate them into that conflict as well. But instead, no, you get this kind of moment where everything is hand waved away and the vampires are just let in. And yes, the way that they're allowed in the bar technically conforms to the rules of the film. But in practice, it feels like such a cop-out. And its only purpose is to facilitate this fight sequence that frankly isn't even that well shot, isn't even that fun to watch because it is so dark and so frenetic and so unfocused and has so little like character to it or clear like framing to it that it just feels like such a missed opportunity. And yes, there is one really beautiful shot at the very culmination, at the very finale of this fight sequence. But aside from that, it's just kind of headache inducing. And it's such a shame because it actually feels like a conscious sort of betrayal of everything that's come before. Or maybe even worse, it kind of feels like a concession. It almost feels like something contractual, something that the studios insisted had to be there. Like, oh, well, you're best known for Black Panther. Why don't we at least give the audience like one crowd-pleasing action sequence? And man, I don't know, but this film would be so much higher on this list if it hadn't made that concession, if it hadn't made that easy choice, and had instead had a climax that was the equal to everything that came before. Okay, next up is film number 5, and the 5th movie on my list is The Secret Agent. And you know, it's fitting that this film is right in the dead center of this list because it's probably the film I feel the most sort of ambivalent and internally conflicted about. And not even in the sense of, oh, I loved some of this film and hated some of it. It's more like there's this sort of conflict between my heart and my head on this movie that's really hard to resolve. On the one hand, purely thinking about this film like critically, purely intellectually, I would almost rank it higher because I don't think there's anything structurally wrong with it. I don't think it makes any really profound false moves. I think there's really a lot to love about it. But on an emotional level, this film left me kind of cold. Not checked out, but just not fully emotionally sucked in, not fully absorbed in the movie for some of its runtime. And I guess maybe I should step aside just for a second and give you a short little summary of the premise of this film, just because unlike Sinners, this is not a movie that has been like widely talked about in the larger discourse. So just to be super hyper simplistic, The Secret Agent is a kind of half political thriller, half almost Tarantino-esque crime film about a man who gets on the wrong side of a corrupt Brazilian politician and ends up taking on a secret identity in order to reconnect with his son and find out some secrets about his family history with the hopes of ultimately escaping the country. And before I say anything else, I just want to give this film unequivocal credit for one thing. And that's that it has, I think, the best opening scene of any movie on this list, of any film nominated for Best Picture this year. And I don't want to spoil this scene too much because I just think it's so sublime and so perfect. I'll just say that it involves a gas station and a dead body and a couple of corrupt police officers. And the way this scene plays out is not only like incredibly bleakly funny, but it's also like a perfect microcosm of the larger film and its ideas and its themes and its tension and its world. I think a really great opening sequence is one that somehow simultaneously manages to really capture perfectly the larger essence of the film that it's introducing you to, and also could somehow stand alone completely perfectly, almost as its own short or short story. And this opening sequence does both, and it does both perfectly, just meticulously, just like beautifully. And while unfortunately the rest of the film doesn't quite live up to the promise of that opening sequence, it still has a heck of a lot going for it. It has a lot of really entertaining black humor. It has some great performances. It has some really fun, I don't even want to say ideas. It has a really fun approach to filmmaking. And one of the things I really do authentically love about this movie is the way that it's fully committed to the idea of a sort of unreliable narrator's version of history. Or rather, maybe more precisely, the idea that history really does exist purely as a series of independent narratives told by people. That history is always going to be a function of perspective and a function of storytelling. And this movie has some great, almost nested sequences where you'll be listening to someone else tell a version of events, and the movie will kind of slide in and out of these different layers of perspective in a really, I think, fun and compelling way. And there's at least one sequence in the film where you're led to believe initially that you're looking at something real and maybe objective before it becomes more and more absurd, and you slowly start to realize, no, this is a deeply unreliable and flawed retelling of events. And man, I'm someone who just loves unreliable narrators and trying to tease out whether you can trust someone's perspective or not, and whether a scene is telling you everything and can be trusted as a truly objective version of reality, or whether it's warped in some way. But I think also, unfortunately, sometimes this approach becomes a sort of weakness of the film because it adds a kind of distance and a kind of, I don't want to say insincerity, but maybe almost irony to certain moments that might have been better played straight, that might have been better just allowed to have their full emotional impact. And a side effect of this approach is that two very critical moments in this movie occur entirely or almost entirely in dialogue, which generally is something I'd actually be kind of into. Like, if you can have a character speak instead of showing action on screen, that's exactly the kind of like sick thing that gets me interested. That sort of denial of the easy approach to a scene, to a sequence, is something that often I really dig. But for some reason, in this movie in particular, the way these two scenes are presented left me feeling kind of flat and kind of detached. And I think that does become kind of a problem because without spoiling anything, those two sequences are arguably the two most important sequences in the film. One occurs right near the middle of the movie, and the other occurs at the very end. And once again, without giving anything away, everything that happens before and after those sequences is entirely contingent upon the story being told in those moments, or the stories being told in those moments. And those stories are, in a weird way, perhaps not as riveting and not as compelling as everything else in the movie. And that's kind of a shame because ultimately you end up with a film that seems just immaculate on paper. just immaculate maybe on the screenplay level. But in practice, in execution, sometimes just seems a little too mannered and a little too, I've said this word multiple times already, but detached. And arguably maybe sterile. But it's still actually a pretty damn good movie nonetheless. All right, time for movie number 4. And the 4th film on this list is Train Dreams. And boy, in another parallel universe where this film is just slightly different, it probably would have been number 1 on this list. Just to quickly do the synopsis thing again, because I think this is another of the more obscure movies on this list. This movie is about a logger who lives in Idaho at the turn of the century, at the turn of the 20th century, who lives this kind of reclusive and quietly tragic life. Let's put it that way without spoiling anything. And man, this film does so much that seems almost designed to appeal to me and my taste in films personally. I love movies that aren't so much about plot and what we know happens to a character as they are about characters who are put in situations where they don't really understand what's happening to them, where they're really struggling to comprehend the nature of the world around them and where they fit into it, and whether there's meaning and purpose and direction there or not, whether the universe is sort of purely random and cruel or actually has some kind of sublime, mystical, and almost purposeful beauty to it. And this is a beautiful film, probably maybe easily the prettiest film to look at of any on this list. And pretty in a way that's almost in direct contradiction to something like Frankenstein. Instead of you just being bombarded with endless, almost cluttered detail and a sense of just lavish, deadening excess, instead, this film is beautiful in a very restrained and stark and almost empty way. You have so many shots that are just about one thing, so many shots of largely empty landscapes that still manage to just be gorgeously lit, and so many shots where there's a single captivating focal point to the shot. And that stark, understated beauty perfectly complements a film that is otherwise very stark and very understated, but still full of really deep, profound, and effective feeling. Like Hamnet, a large amount of this film is dedicated to the exploration of grief and trying to make sense of loss and separation. And unlike Hamnet, which mostly communicated that through a lot of moaning and howling and just visceral pained noise and darkness and dreariness, this film is so much softer and gentler and quieter in the way it looks at how we handle grief. But no less honest and no less profound. I would say arguably much more honest to actual human experience and much more profound in the way that it looks at grief, in the way that it allows you to just kind of feel that sadness, feel that sense of being alone, feel that sense of having lost something that's deeply precious to you and not knowing why or how or if it can be recovered in any way. And can I also say, while I'm talking about things that I liked about this movie, one more trivial thing, which is that it's an hour and 40 some minutes long. And listen, I sort of binged a lot of these movies. A couple of them, Sinners and a movie that I haven't gotten to yet, I watched earlier in the year. But the other 8 films I watched over the course of a couple of weeks. And so many of the movies nominated are 2.5 hours, 2 hours and 40 minutes long, and feel bloated, feel like they haven't taken advantage of that length, feel like they've got a lot of just dead excess, feel almost like, oh yeah, we're making Oscar bait, so of course it needs to be well over 2 hours long. This is a prestige film. We need to give the audience 2 hours and 30 minutes. And here you have a movie that's an hour and 40 minutes long, not even close to 2 full hours, and yet that manages to capture somehow the essence, the almost full and almost complete essence of a human life in a way that doesn't seem compromised, doesn't seem pared down, doesn't seem too tightly or too closely edited or cropped. It feels complete. It feels like you've just let this entire human existence wash over you. And you've done it in a reasonable amount of time. So, okay, it sounds like I really love this film, right? So why is it at number 4 and not higher? Well, this is another one of those one kind of big flaw situations. And in this case, that flaw is that it has a really cloying, frankly, omniscient third person narration. You have this omniscient narrator who's always just kind of there, who is not in any way identified with the main character and seems to comment on his life in this kind of detached, borderline ironic, really kind of twee way. And listen, I'm not one of these people who says, oh, there should never be narrators in films. I think some people take that criticism too far, the show don't tell thing. I think there have been a lot of films that have really benefited from having some kind of narrator. I mean, obviously, pretty much every noir detective film has used this trope to death, and a lot of them are the better for it. And in other instances, a narrator, especially a first-person narrator, can give you insights into the thoughts of a character who might otherwise be pretty closed off and pretty hard to understand. But in this case, I feel like the narration really lends everything this sort of cutesy vibe that sucks some of the meaning and some of the poignancy out of these scenes. There are so many scenes in this movie that would be more intense, more beautiful, if not for the fact that someone is talking over them to tell you something that you can kind of see if you just sat there and meditated with it, if you just sat there and lived with the film and with the images and characters that are on screen. And some of this twee kind of cutesy cloyingness extends to some of the dialogue as well. Listen, I'm not someone who says if you have backwoods, rustic characters, they should talk like hillbillies or they should talk like they're ignorant. I don't think that at all. I come from the country. I grew up in the boondocks, and I know there are plenty of like really intelligent, lucid people out there in the world who aren't urbanites. But it's not even that this dialogue is too erudite for these characters. Sometimes it just does not seem like something a real human being would say. Sometimes it seems so philosophical or even pop philosophical that you say, ooh, I don't know if someone would actually say those words. And maybe actually we would have gotten the point just as well if they didn't, or if they had said less, or if they had said what they said, but more crudely. And I do kind of wonder why these creative choices were made, especially the narrator. And this is a small detour, but I was thinking about it and I have 3 theories. The first is that this is an adaptation of a novella, and maybe the director and screenwriter simply thought, well, the best way to adapt this novella is to take as much of the original language as possible, and the easiest way to do that is to incorporate this third-person narrator. And yeah, I can see that desire to keep the language if that's what they were going for, but I don't really think it works here. My second theory is that the director has flat out said that he was inspired by Terrence Malick, and I do wonder if he's trying for a kind of Days of Heaven thing here. But the difference between the narrator in that film and the narrator in this film is, in that film, first of all, the narrator is a character within the film. It's this young girl who's kind of caught up in this larger series of events. And the other thing about that narrator being this young girl is she's not omniscient. She actually doesn't really understand what the hell is happening to her most of the time. And so the narration doesn't provide this sort of distanced perspective. Instead, it provides the perspective of someone who's in the middle of all this, trying to grok it, trying to figure it out. And so it works in conjunction with the themes and the feeling of the film, instead of being strangely at odds with that feeling, which is how I feel this narration is. And my third and frankly most cynical theory is that Netflix made them do it. So this is a Netflix film. Netflix funded this film. And Netflix has a bad habit, a bad, well-documented habit of trying to force a lot of exposition and explanatory dialogue into films that don't need it. Because they think, oh, well, people are streaming this, they're only half watching it, the film needs to explain what's going on periodically. It needs to have like a plot refresher every now and again. And I'm kind of scared that that's what happened, that this film was actually artistically compromised so that like someone can watch it while they're making dinner, or someone can take a bathroom break and come back without pausing and still know where they are. And if that's the case, that really sucks, because this film is like within a hair's breadth of being one of the best of the year. But nonetheless, I really enjoyed this movie. I recommend you watch it. It is the one and only movie on this list that brought me really, really close to tears, where I could like feel myself choking up and I had to be like, no, don't, come on, don't give in. But yeah, it's just a powerful movie. Ooh, okay, we've made it to film number 3. And that movie is Sentimental Value. And this is honestly and easily the biggest surprise on this list. On its surface, this seems like the most Oscar baity film to ever Oscar bait. So let's break this film down into its component parts and see how many Oscar bait boxes it checks. First of all, this is a foreign language film. Secondly, it's about a dysfunctional family. Third, the father in the family is an aging director. One of the daughters is an actress. Fourth, it uses the fact that it's a film about an actress and a director as an excuse to use film itself, the art of film itself, as a metaphor or as a lens through which to explore their relationship. Fifth, the thing being explored is their family trauma and their psychological hang-ups and hardships. And do I have to go on? Like, you can just see it, right? Like, you're picturing a very specific kind of film, and you're picturing a very specific kind of film that seems almost tailored just to win awards, almost tailored to be like, oh, the people who are going to be on the juries deciding whether or not to give awards to films are going to look very much like the people in this film. So it seems superficially almost cynical in that way. And listen, this film opens with a monologue from another omniscient third-person narrator where they're talking about the home that has been in this family for generations, the home that the director grew up in, the home that his actress daughter grew up in, the home that has been the site of all their trauma and all their experiences. And it's very clearly and explicitly using this house as a metaphor for the state of this family in a way that I can just feel your eyes rolling into the back of your head right now as I describe it, because you know how obvious that metaphor is, because you've seen metaphors like that in other movies before, and they often seem easy and flat. And granted, I will say that within this film, within the context of this film, that monologue is actually presented as something the daughter wrote when she was younger. So there's a little bit of added context. And there's a little moment at the end of the monologue where it talks about the daughter going back and rereading what she wrote when she was younger in the hopes of using it like in an audition, and discovering that it did fall kind of flat, that it seemed kind of shallow. So I'm not going to hold the film in complete contempt for subjecting me to this monologue. But boy, as openings go, it kind of gave me pause and kind of made me say, oh no, is this the kind of film that I'm in for? But no, my preconceptions about this film were entirely wrong. Every scene in this film is richer, better, deeper, more nuanced, more psychologically complex, and frankly more interesting than the one before it. The way it explores these characters, the depth that it gives them, the perfection of the performances, and the way those performances add depth to a screenplay that already really fleshed out these human lives. It just grows and grows and grows and becomes richer and deeper and more real and more profound with every passing minute. And it also really avoids some of the tropes and cliches we associate with this premise. I think in another film, in a lot of films, the trauma and the drama in this family would both be way more pronounced. There would be way more melodrama, right? Instead, the movie is very gentle in its characterization and very gentle in the way it explores these relationships. Yes, these people have hurt each other. Yes, these people are holding on to things from the past. Yes, the two daughters in the family kind of, and especially the actress daughter, kind of feel abandoned by their father on some level, neglected on some level. But it's not the kind of just brute abandonment and neglect that we see in a lot of movies like this. And the director, who's played by Stellan Skarsgård, that performance and that character is allowed to be so much more gentle, so much gentler than it would be in another film. He's allowed to be kind of charming and kind of charismatic, and he's allowed to have real profound feeling, and he's allowed to legitimately use his art as a way to explore his relationships and to explore his regrets. And likewise, the daughters are much more ambivalent in their feelings about him. It's not just like, oh, this man neglected me, I hate him. Instead, you can see how they're often charmed and won over by him, and yet how this stuff from the past, this detritus from the past, clings to them and prevents them from fully embracing him. And I'll also say, and I hate to keep sort of going back to beat on Hamnet. Well, maybe I don't totally hate it. The film. But anyway, I do want to say, though, that in some ways, this movie is a deeper and more interesting exploration of Shakespearean themes than that film is. For example, the centerpiece of Hamlet the play is the play within the play that Hamlet stages to try to figure out whether his uncle is guilty of the murder of his father, and the play that's staged as a kind of like psychological probing of the characters who are participating in it. And well, the characters who are participating in it and also watching it, also the audience for it. And yes, Hamnet does do that. And as I said before, the ways in which it does that are one of its stronger elements. But this film and the film within this film and the way that film within the film becomes a sort of mirror, to use a cliched metaphor, that reflects back the larger psychological truths of the film in a way that the characters themselves can finally understand. The way this film does that is just so much more delicate and eloquent and elegant than the way that Hamnet does it. And also, as long as we're talking about that sort of meta element to the film, there are a lot of scenes in this film where you're not sure at the very beginning of the scene whether you're watching something that's actually occurring to these characters within the universe of the film, or whether you're watching a performance within the universe of the film, whether that's a scene from a film within the film, or whether it's a theatrical performance within the film. And that, the way, the richness of that, and the framing of that, and the way that it always makes you question the reality of what you're watching and the truth of what you're watching, I think is really thematically effective. And maybe more thematically effective here than the similar things going on in The Secret Agent were. I'll also say, while we're on the Shakespeare front, there's a little King Lear in this film. I mean, you have the father and his three daughters. Well, in this film, it's two actual biological daughters and a kind of adopted daughter in the form of this actress who he hires to play a role that he originally offers to his daughter and she turns down. And I don't really have much to say about the Lear stuff, except that, like I've mentioned King Lear in past videos, and I've mentioned things, Shakespearean themes and elements in other videos. And I just like, if you've watched some of my previous videos, I guess I'm just dropping this as a kind of Easter egg for you or whatever, because I don't feel like I have that much to say about it, except it's there and it's kind of cool. But yeah, this movie is just so rich and so moving and so psychologically acute and psychologically astute. And beyond that, and this is not a spoiler, but this film, Sentimental Value, easily had the best final scene or best final sequence of any film on this list. It's a sequence that perfectly captures all of the elements that I've talked about, perfectly pays off every relationship in this film in a subtle way that perfectly interweaves all the film's plot elements, all its themes, its characters' relationships, all of the like weird metaphorical baggage of the house and everything else. All of the components of this film are paid off elegantly and precisely and perfectly in this final scene that I will otherwise not spoil at all. So yeah, it's just a great film. Even if you have an aversion to Oscar bait, you should sit down, you should watch it. It's really, really good. Okay, we've reached the penultimate film on this list, film number 2, and that film is Marty Supreme. All right, so this movie has a deceptively simple premise. On the surface, it's about a man named Marty Mauser who wants to become the world champion of table tennis. And listening to that premise, you might say, oh, this is another underdog sports film like F1. And to that, I'd say, yeah, sort of. It has the elements of an underdog sports story, and it has kind of even roughly the same plot structure in that everything is sort of, in theory, building towards this final big match. You have a bunch of scenes of the sport itself being played, intercut with human drama, and you have this sense of escalating stakes and tension throughout the movie. Yeah, it does sound kind of like a generic sports film, except except in execution, in practice, it bears almost no resemblance to what you'd expect from that film. It's not sappy or sentimental in that way. And more than that, though, it's just insane. It is just absolutely unhinged and maniacal. This is a film that never slows down, never lets the tension drop or cool for even a moment, is always building towards its next moment of this like uncomfortable uncertainty. The next like sequence where you just know that the characters are, through choices of their own, going to force themselves in more and more tense and uncomfortable and difficult and borderline disturbing situations. The film has this sheer focused, maniacal sense of energy and sense of purpose that actually perfectly matches its central character, that perfectly matches Marty himself. Because Marty Mauser is a man so hilariously consumed by his obsession with ping pong and his desire to build what we would today call a brand out of ping pong, to use ping pong as the means by which he will build his personal egotistical empire. He's so laser focused on that goal that it's unbelievable. It's simultaneously completely hilarious, completely absurd and completely hilarious, but also completely believable. This is a character that you say, oh yeah, I understand. I have met people like that. I have seen people who in their lives are so monomaniacal, who are so consumed by obsession and so consumed by ego that there are no obstacles to what they're willing to do in order to self-actualize, right? In their own twisted way. And what's really wild, though, is even though the film is so focused on this one character and lets his essence just permeate the entire thing, it still works on so many different levels and in so many different ways. It works as a sports film. It works as a character study. It works as a crime thriller. It works as a really hilarious black comedy. It just works on every level that it attempts to work on. It's really kind of amazing and kind of sublime. Hell, even the ping pong scenes are somehow unbelievably compelling. And I say this as a person who has never watched a table tennis match, who has some vague memory of once playing table tennis in a friend's basement in like high school and of being really, really bad at it and not understand, not having the spatial awareness or desire to get good at this game. So even as a table tennis skeptic, and even as someone who understands that the absurdity and fundamental triviality of ping pong is sort of at the heart of this movie, is sort of half the point of this movie, even knowing that the movie is sort of making fun of the sport on some level, man, it doesn't matter. When those balls start flying from one end of the table to another, and when the kind of like acrobatic like movement with the rackets and the back and forth, the pacing of it all, and the way that so much of it is filmed in these kind of distant shots that let you see so much of what's happening on the table. Man, it's so fun. It's so compelling. I got kind of sold on table tennis. And I'll say too that this is probably the most consistent film on this list. And I think you could make an argument that it should be in first place. And if you're just looking for a film that from scene one to the final scene is just immaculate without, where you never say, oh, that could have been done a little better, or oh, that could have been done a little different. If you want a film that's just a pure diabolical machine, that is this kind of closed loop where the beginning and the end fit perfectly together and everything in between is just endless stress, but also riveting stress, then maybe this movie should be number one. I will say one small thing, and this really can't be considered a knock against the film, but if you've seen Uncut Gems, you're going to be saying, oh yeah, a lot. Which is to say that this film very closely mimics the structure of that film. Emotionally, like the experience of watching this film is very similar. There's a very similar cadence and rhythm to the two films. And like I said, you can't say, oh, that's a knock against the film. Because is the film made worse by the fact that a very similar film exists from the same director? Or, well, Josh was only half of the pair for Uncut Gems. But you get my point, right? That the same artist created two rather similar works. It takes away a little, I guess, from the sense of surprise, the sense of pure shock of this experience. And it does kind of prime you to expect the fact that this film is going to keep escalating and that when you think a problem is solved, it's only going to get more complicated and uglier. But there are a lot of films that do that. So maybe I personally would have enjoyed this film just a hair more if I had never seen Uncut Gems. And I do honestly think that this is a better film than Uncut Gems. But it's hard for it to totally step out of the shadow of Uncut Gems. But this is film number 2 on the list. So we're really in great film territory here regardless. And I will say, I think the thing that actually kept it just short of number 1 is that it doesn't have the inventiveness, the sheer unhinged novelty of that film. And so what film am I talking about? What film did make number 1 on this list? What film is the best, in my opinion, of all the films nominated for Best Picture this year? Well, if you've been following along, you probably already know that that film is One Battle After Another. All right, I have to fess up to something here. I am a huge Paul Thomas Anderson fan. There Will Be Blood would probably be my choice, or at least one of my choices, for best film of the 21st century so far. This is a director who has made multiple films that I consider to be complete masterpieces, and several that I think are just great, just really, really, really good, who has never made a film that I disliked. And yet, even so, I didn't go into the process of making this video, of watching all these films, thinking that One Battle After Another would necessarily be the top film on this list. In fact, after I watched it, and it's one of the two films, along with Sinners, that I watched prior to the rest of the movies on this list, I I was left thinking, oh, this is kind of lesser Paul Thomas Anderson. This is maybe one of his more minor films. I thought, yeah, maybe the political satire was a little silly and a little slapstick. Maybe it could have been more sharp and incisive. And yeah, the final scene is kind of a letdown, kind of formulaic, once again, without spoiling anything. And yeah, I was expecting more. And it's easy for your mind to fill up with all of these little quibbles and these little issues that you have with a film. But then I sat back and I thought about it, and I thought about it, and I said, well, what film did I really enjoy the most this year? What film made me laugh the most, made me the most excited, made me the most riveted and captivated and drawn in? What film really did I feel the most when I was watching it? And I thought, well, there's something to be said for Marty Supreme. There's something to be said for the sheer, once again, maniacal energy of that film. There's something to be said for Sentimental Value and how perfectly and meticulously constructed it is, and how every scene builds on the one before it, and how you just get deeper and deeper and richer and richer. And there's something to be said for the fact that Train Dreams almost made me cry. And boy, I thought about it, and in my heart of hearts, I just kept coming back to One Battle After Another. I just kept coming back to how fun this film is, how enjoyable it was to watch, how surprising it was, how frequently it subverted my expectations and showed me things that I never expected to see, couldn't possibly have predicted. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized, yeah, One Battle After Another just succeeds more than these other films on a scene by scene level. And that's really what it comes down to. Movies obviously are composed of individual scenes, and every scene has to be framed, every scene has to be purposeful, every scene has to show you something, ideally, that you've never seen before, make you experience something that you feel like you've never felt before. Every scene has to deliver, and ideally, every scene delivers something of value. And ideally, every scene is a piece of craftsmanship, is a piece of art in and of itself. So if you view the movies on this list as being a series of scenes and critique and evaluate them that way, then wow, One Battle After Another just keeps delivering incredible scenes. There are two scenes in this film that I think I will remember long after I've forgotten every single other scene from every single other movie on this list. And I don't want to spoil those sequences. I want you to go in fresh. I want you to experience them for yourself. I will say that one of them is a car chase scene that eclipses everything in F1, that is more compelling than everything in F1, and that films the act of multiple cars pursuing each other in a way that is totally different than any car chase scene I've seen in any other movie before, and is frankly more compelling than most of those scenes. And I will say that it manages to be compelling not by showing you a wide, unbroken view of the action, not by showing you as much of the chase as it possibly can, but rather by withholding a lot of information and constraining your field of view and limiting what you can see at any given moment. And also, even though I kind of said at the top that maybe the movie was a little too slapstick, Oh, it's so funny. It's so funny. It's such a hilariously funny film. There's no doubt in my mind that I laughed more at this film than any other movie on this list. And there are multiple comedies on this list. Marty Supreme is a very funny movie, but it's not as funny as One Battle After Another. It doesn't have the sheer number of true, honest to goodness, like belly laughs that this film has. Leonardo DiCaprio's performance in this film is so pathetic, so hilariously pathetic, and so self-effacing, and so perfect. Like, you can talk about, oh, this actor really sacrificed for this role. And a lot of the times that means, oh, they put themselves through a lot of emotional pain. Or, they really let themselves feel traumatized in the way their character was traumatized. But few actors are willing to sacrifice as much of their own ego to make a performance great as Leonardo DiCaprio is. And it's not just in this movie. Think of how loathsome he allows himself to be in Django Unchained, or how just really banal he allows himself to be in Killers of the Flower Moon. Like, that performance is just so deeply irredeemable, by which I mean his character is such a perfect encapsulation of the banality of evil in that film, and is so completely unflattering and so frankly dumb that it's remarkable to see an actor who was once this kind of teenage heartthrob allow himself to be portrayed in that light, and that just deeply and entirely unflattering light. And the same goes for this film as well. He is such a fried, disorganized loser in this film. He allows himself to be so pathetic. And this is me flattering his performance, by the way. This is me saying, yes, there's nothing self-serving about this performance. He completely sacrifices himself. He completely sacrifices his own ego to this role. And it's beautiful. It's so funny. And it's so perversely enjoyable to watch. And also, I've seen some discourse about this movie and its politics in particular. And some people saying, oh, well, this isn't really contemporary politics. Like, by adapting Pynchon's Vineland, which is what this film is sort of doing very loosely, Paul Thomas Anderson took the content from Vineland, where the flashbacks are set in the 60s and the present day sections are set in the 80s, and kind of transposed it on a contemporary American landscape, in a way, a contemporary American political landscape, in a way that doesn't quite jive, where you feel like you're getting a little bit of the 2020s and a little bit of the 1960s and a little bit of the 1980s, and that it didn't work. But I kind of disagree. I think what you actually end up with is this sort of wild act of world building. This sense that Paul Thomas Anderson has created a universe that, yeah, it does have a little bit of 60s radicalism in it. It does have a little bit of 80s cynicism. And it does have a lot of contemporary ideas and contemporary issues like immigration. And it is all kind of combined. But it's combined in a way that provides a sort of sick, warped insight into the larger American political world, universe. Instead of narrowly being a film about the present day and the issues, the big important issues of the present day, and instead of just being a film about washed out, fried former radicals from the 60s, you get this sort of composite work that gets at the emotional core of all of those things and finds an emotional through line through American political history, or at least recent American political history, at least the American history, the American political history of the post-war era, the post-World War II era, the era that begins with flower children and hippie radicalism and ends with Trump and immigration camps and all of the issues that we're arguing about online ad nauseum today. And I'll also be honest, I deeply enjoy the fact that this is a film that doesn't seem to satisfy any form of political ideologue. Like whether you're on the left, on the right, whether you're progressive or leftist or conservative or MAGA or whatever, like anyone I have seen online who is an ideologue through and through, who is a partisan through and through, seems to have real serious qualms about this film, seems to have like real profound objections to this film. And I love that, honestly, because what I think this film gets at is that politics is a function of political people, that politics is ultimately a function of personalities, of human minds, of human behavior, and not this thing, this sort of abstract thing that gets forced on people from without, that exists out there and just kind of like falls on us and crushes us. No, it's our own choices that generate our politics, that generate the political world that we all live in. And those choices are often banal and stupid and narrow, and a function of our banal, stupid, narrow minds and our pathology and our hang-ups and the things that we just can't understand or refuse to understand or refuse to look clearly at, and just the deep, profound confusion and absurdity and selfishness at the core of the human experience. And I think a lot of partisan political people don't want to think about it that way. They don't want to think, oh, what is it in me that makes these politics appealing to me? What is it in my needs or wants or in my history or in my weird hang-ups and obsessions that makes me want to be MAGA, that makes me want to be a leftist, that makes me want to be intersectional, that makes me want to be woke, that makes me want to be whatever, that makes me want to believe what I believe in the core of my being. And the end result of all of this is this almost psychedelic or kaleidoscopic view of the absurdity and incoherence of American politics. And man, I love it. It's just so funny and so ultimately, actually, I think, profound. And so with that in mind, it's really easy for me to overlook my minor quibbles with this film. And even though I still think it's sort of lesser Paul Thomas Anderson, I have to say, I do think it's the best film nominated for Best Picture this year. And above and beyond that, I have definitely not seen every film released in 2025, but right now it would be my choice for Best Movie of the Year. And yeah, that's it. That's my ranking. I'm done. If you enjoyed this, if this was fun, if it was insightful, if it was a good way to kill some time before you went to bed or whatever, please, if you wouldn't mind, maybe think about subscribing, liking the video. Once again, leaving a comment. Feel free. Disagree with me in the comments. Keep it nice, but give me your opinions. I want to hear them. And yeah, I guess that's it. Thanks for listening. I'm done. Or is it? And the seventh film on this ranking is Bugonia. 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 Bugonia, like the flower. Oh. God damn it.